I'm Trent MacNamara, professor of U.S. history at Texas A&M University. One of the best known stories to come out of the American West goes like this. In 1848, the U.S. defeats Mexico in the Mexican-American War and annexes Mexico's thinly settled northern half. Before the dust has settled in that war, an American working at a remote trading post called Sutter's Fort in what's then a remote region called California sees gold in a riverbed. He tries to keep it a secret, he fails, and an avalanche of young men drop everything, gallop across the desert from the eastern US with their pickaxes and their gold pans and make millions of dollars. And California becomes the Golden State overnight. That's a great story. It's true as far as it goes, but like all stories from the American West, there's more to it. And I want to tell a bigger story of the California Gold Rush, a story that's perhaps closer to the experience of people on the ground. So a first thing to know about the Gold Rush is that in 1848, California was neither unsettled by colonists nor was it unknown to Americans. The settler population before the gold rush is something like 15,000. It's primarily Mexican, but there are also some Americans in California. They're merchants in the cattle trade, or they're settlers who had begun to trickle in off the Oregon Trail in the 1840s. Then there's also a much larger but less well-remembered population of Native Americans, who despite the toll of disease still numbered about 150,000, so about 10 times more than the settlers. Those Native Americans lived by hunting and fishing and gathering, notably gathering acorns from the oaks that blanket much of California at this time, and they would grind those acorns into flour for bread. A second thing we often overlook about the gold rush is that natives knew there was gold in the California mountains. They had shown it to Spanish and Mexican settlers, and so by the mid-1840s, there are 20-some Mexican mines in California, including one very large one, although nothing on the scale of what is to come. A third point about the gold rush, that the rush of Americans from the East is not instant. The Sutter's Fort strike sets off a local gold rush. The small town of San Francisco empties out. Newspapers stop printing. The local government stops meeting. Soldiers desert the US Army. But when news of gold reaches the eastern US in the summer of 1848, there is a collective yawn. People in the East are used to reports of gold, they're used to reports of paradise in the West, and they are skeptical, often rightly skeptical. It's only that winter when ears begin to perk up, when President James K. Polk publishes a report by California's military governor that says, amongst other things, that 6 miners employing 50 Native Americans had extracted 273 pounds, not ounces, of gold from the California hills in just a few months. This is the point at which Americans in the East drop everything, sell everything, and head west, either over land or by ship. About 90,000 people arrive in 1849 alone. These are the so-called 49ers. In that year, 1849, they dig more gold than had been produced in all previous US history. So in 1849, they produce the equivalent in our modern currency of $250 million in gold. By 1850, that's $1 billion in gold. In 1851 and 2, it's about $2 billion in each of those years. As this gold rush occurs, the settler population doubles and doubles and doubles again. It increases about 10 times in the 3 years after the gold strike. A forest of abandoned ships litters the harbor in San Francisco because as sailors arrived, they would desert their ships, which could not be sailed onwards. The sailors fanned out into the gold fields. A fourth point to understand about the gold rush is that not all the newcomers are from the eastern US. That group is a majority, but something like 1 in 5 miners are from someplace else. They're from Europe, for example, Britain or France. They're from Mexico. That group includes many of the first experienced and skilled miners who come from the nearby Mexican state of Sonora. And then miners come from all over the Pacific, from Chile, Australia, from Hawaii, eventually from China. These are places that it's important to remember are not always much further than the east coast of America if you have to sail around South America. Early on, many of these miners from all over the world cooperate because they're scrambling to pull gold out of the ground before somebody else does. But as time moves on, there's more and more competition, and sometimes violent competition. The violence increases in particular as more and more Americans arrive from the east. Many of them are frustrated by the lack of an immediate bonanza in the gold fields. They figure this land is American, it's won by conquest in a recent war, and whatever gold we can pull out must be for Americans. Their hostility is directed in particular at Mexican and Chinese miners, but also at Chileans, French, Australians, and so on. And there are many attempts to drive off those foreign miners, both inside and outside the law. So there's simple intimidation and robbery. For example, a group of Americans follows a foreign miner back to his successful claim and steals that claim with a group of armed men, knowing that that act is less likely to be prosecuted if it's perpetrated by Americans on a foreigner. The state also passes laws designed to exclude foreigners from the mines. So in 1850, the new state of California, in one of its first acts, passes a foreign miners tax, which is designed to be so expensive that it chases off non-Americans. Now, if you are a non-American miner, there are different responses to this intimidation and these laws. Some foreign miners stand and fight, others leave California, some go to work in marginal mining areas, others go to work for wages, and some take American partners as a sort of shield against persecution. So the mines are a tough road to riches, especially if you are a non-American. That said, new arrivals as a group are comparatively fortunate relative to California's native inhabitants. So if you are, say, Mexican or Chilean or French, or if you're one of many American 49ers, a typical bad outcome is that you don't find gold, or you get your claim stolen, and you return home angry or humiliated. For natives, a typical bad outcome is death. The gold rush is a disaster for Native Americans. About 6 in 7 natives of California die in the 3 decades after 1849. They die as a result of exposure to new diseases as miners crowd in. They die as a result of loss of food sources. For example, the miners would hunt game animals, or they would pollute fishing streams, or they would chop the oaks that provided acorns for bread. Natives' hunger leads to raiding for food, raiding to defend land from the miners, and then to retaliation from the miners, and cycles of escalating conflict, which sometimes end in wars of extermination. At least 10,000 Native Americans are killed directly by newly arriving miners in the 25 years after the gold rush. The state militia in California kills at least 1,300 Native Americans. The U.S. Army at least 1,600, and vigilantes at least 6,400. This is not a secret campaign. In 1851, California's governor says, quote, "A war of extermination will continue to be waged until the Indian race becomes extinct." Meanwhile, state lawmakers back up the governor by, for example, blocking Indian reservations from becoming a reality in California, not because they dislike the idea of confining Native Americans, but because they want natives to have no refuge, to be running and dying. Lawmakers also allowed Native Americans to be forced into labor, a policy that led to violent kidnappings for hard labor in the mines and elsewhere, and low survival rates for Native Americans who are forced into labor. So that's not to say that the gold mines are an easy place for anyone to get by, even if you are a white American. There are plenty of accidents, there's plenty of disease, robbery, fighting, killing within that group. The mining population is over 90% male in the early years. There's lots of drinking, gambling. Nearly everyone is armed. Some are near starvation. Most are presumed to have gold on their person. The gold rush is a bit more orderly than we tend to remember, but nevertheless, it still has sky-high murder rates, much worse than any modern US city, and partly as a result, it has a lot of mob justice. The kind of justice where to be unpopular or to be suspicious could get you killed quickly for a crime that you did or did not commit. Now back east and around the world, all of this is told as a big adventure. An adventure story where hardy, independent men picked up their lives, got their mule and their pickaxe, and made their way in a tough world with guts and savvy. And there are elements of that story that are true for thousands of miners. But it's important to realize that it's a story. And it's a story in particular that is told for the benefit of Easterners at this time. So in the middle and late 19th century, Americans in the East are becoming more and more likely to work in a factory or an office, to live in a town, to have people and bosses crowding around them, wanting things from them. And very often they want to escape from that, at least in a story. There are plenty of artists and writers willing to supply that story of freedom and independence for them through the vehicle of the California Gold Rush. But life on the ground for the miners in California is often brutal. And many of the miners would have given everything to have never gone west in the first place. And that's probably something that they would have wanted us to know and understand about them. So even those miners who strike gold, they have a tough economic road. California is a very good place to make money during the gold rush. It's unfortunately also a good place to lose money because you get your claim stolen, or you meet a con man or a professional gambler. Then there are also unavoidable expenses that come with living in a gold rush environment. It's very costly to get there. It costs around the average annual salary of a worker to arrive in California by land or by sea. Everyday prices in California at this time are mind-boggling. So there are reports of a slice of toast being sold for the equivalent of 50 of our modern US dollars, a dozen eggs for $90, a pickaxe for $1,500, pound of coffee, $1,200, a pair of boots, 3,000 of our modern dollars. So this is why California is famous for making shopkeepers rich, people who don't go out and scratch in the dirt, but people who, as they said, would mine the miners, selling the miners beef or whiskey or mules, and often making small and large fortunes in that process. Some of those fortunes are made by women. Women in the gold rush are most famous for selling sexual services, and it's true that there are many prostitutes in Gold Rush, California. But women also rent rooms, or make food, or mend clothes, or wash clothes, and sell their presence to men who missed the company of women. So there are stories of saloon girls who would be paid an ounce of gold simply to sit next to a customer, or the equivalent of $250 of our dollars for a biscuit made by a woman. One woman makes the equivalent of $100,000 for turning a hand organ and making music in the presence of the miners. So prices are high in California. Perhaps the biggest obstacle to making a huge fortune in California as a miner, however, is getting the millions of dollars that you need to fully exploit a successful claim. The biggest fortunes in California are typically not made by the first person on the ground. Instead, they're made by investors in faraway cities who buy proven claims, paying claims, and then invest in industrial-style mining. So that could be hard rock mining, as it's called, where you follow the gold and minerals deep into the ground. It could be hydraulic mining, meaning you build a network of reservoirs and canals and ultra-high pressure hoses and blast away whole hillsides, sending a stew of mud and sand and gravel and chemicals down from the hill. This is a practice that eventually farmers downstream will protest, and this will lead to some of this country's first environmental laws. The gold rush is messy, both in the literal and the figurative sense. It makes a few people very rich. It improves the lives of thousands of people. It is a minor disaster for thousands more, and is a major fatal disaster for thousands more on top of that. It creates the largest short-term migration in US history. It establishes Americans as the dominant force on the Pacific coast of this continent. It took what had been a peripheral area in the world economy and very quickly makes it integral. California becomes a major supplier of gold that facilitates trade of all kinds all over the world, and it becomes a less isolated and rural place. For better or worse, after the gold rush, California has the same sort of industries, cities, investment flows, transportation links as elsewhere in the industrializing world. All of this builds up a store of wealth and population that more or less directly allows California to become the economic engine that it is today. That's the gold rush. Thank you.